Hi, my name is Declan Waugh. I've been asked to explain, give a background as to myself and how I got involved in fluoridation, so I'll try and be as brief as possible with it. I'm an environmental scientist by profession, and most of my work is in risk management and due diligence in various areas like contaminated sites and water quality and environmental impact assessment of projects. I've worked in industry for over 20 years in various capacities in highly polluting industries like the mining industries, as well as in consultancy on very diverse projects, from running an environmental consultancy to renewable energy, to being a consultant to the EPA on establishing environmental quality objectives for noise in Ireland. So my career has been very, very varied. But one area that I really didn't know much about at all up until about 6 years ago was water fluoridation. Partly because we weren't really taught about it in college, and that's not just in my profession. In nearly every scientific profession that I'm aware of, or medical profession, undergraduates know nothing about fluoride. An example being, I met some UCC fourth-year students of medicine in Bandon last week who were raising funds to go to Africa, East Africa, and I spoke with them and I said, you'd better read up about skeletal fluorosis before you go there. And they said, what's skeletal fluorosis? And I said, well, it's an issue that is of paramount importance in East Africa, particularly in Kenya and Tanzania and Ethiopia, because the population are chronically poisoned by fluoride there. And if you're going out there to work in medicine in the hospitals, you need to know something about it. And they said they'd never heard of it before. So you have students there who are basically approaching the end of their medical career who haven't been taught anything about fluoride intoxication at all. And I know quite a lot of medical doctors myself of my own generation who also know nothing about fluoride intoxication. Dentists are generally taught about the benefits of fluoride for the teeth, but dentists are not medical physicians, and they're not taught about the effect of fluoride on the brain or the heart or the lungs or the musculoskeletal tissues of the body, and that's a big problem. And even with that, dentists still have very limited training in regards to what they learn about fluoride in college. There are actually a lot of dentists who are opposed to fluoridation and opposed to fluoride being added to water supplies right across the world, not just in Ireland, but internationally. So people might get the impression that dentists are all pro-water fluoridation, but they're not. I got involved in water fluoridation about 6 years ago. I was asked by an engineer to have a look at it, and we were just about to have a baby ourselves, and I actually thought when I was asked about it that the person was a conspiracy theorist. And I thought, yeah, I'll have a quick look at this over the weekend and I'll get back to him. And the first report that I went to look at was this one. It's actually the most detailed study that's ever been published on fluoride in general. And it was an expert committee established by the National Academy of Sciences and Medicine in the United States, where they picked like 12 or 14 of the most noted academics in various professions to come together, and they spent a number of years researching all of the case studies or all of the literature they could find with regards to fluoride and its health effects, and they produced this book. And as I was reading this book, I was astounded. Astounded wouldn't even be the word. I was shocked, absolutely shocked and appalled at finding that they actually knew very little about the health effects in humans. The study just addressed repeatedly, one after another, recommendations for further studies, and more studies need to be done in order to show that fluoride, the ingestion of fluoride was not harmful to humans, So from a risk management point of view, absolutely, without any doubt, without any question of doubt, the evidence has not been provided to show that ingestion of fluoride is safe. The scales would tip in the other direction and say there have been no studies done to actually clearly demonstrate the health effects of ingesting fluoride on anything bar teeth. And that's what this study addressed. But in the course of reading this, in terms of its effect on thyroid disorders and the genotoxicity of fluoride even, the musculoskeletal effects of fluoride on the human body, I really was quite astonished. There's one particular thing here like that is quite shocking, and it's to do with the genotoxicity of fluoride. And I think anybody who is familiar with the subject area in Ireland, if they read it, would be quite nervous and appalled at what they're stating, because this is what they say on page 197 of the report. They say the possible association of cytogenetic effects with fluoride exposure suggests that Down syndrome is a biologically plausible outcome of exposure. So you have the leading experts in the United States who, after reviewing all the evidence, say that there is evidence to suggest that it is biologically plausible that because fluoride is cytotoxic to genes, that it could cause Down syndrome. And we are a country with the highest rates of Down syndrome in the world. And people will say, oh, that's because we don't have abortion in Ireland, but there's a lot of women go to the UK for abortions, and it still doesn't get away from the fact that evidence has been presented in other case studies to show that the way that fluoride affects or influences Down syndrome is that it affects younger women as opposed to older women. So the risk of having a child with Down syndrome increases if you're under 30 as opposed to if you're over 40. And it increases as fluoride exposure increases. And it brings the risk for younger women up to that of women over 40. And apart from the issue of increasing the risk of Down syndrome, the issue of fluoride toxicity on anybody who is born with Down syndrome is multiplied in many, many ways. All of the diseases that individuals with Down syndrome have would be highly relevant to fluoride ingestion and fluoride toxicity. And the manner in which fluoride would affect and contribute to their disorders would be quite profound. Like the major risk factors for Down syndrome are Alzheimer's disease. They have very high rates of asthma. They have very high rates of leukemia. In this report themselves, they talk about the neurotoxicity of fluoride, and that there's no question but that it has an effect in causing inflammation in the brain. And inflammation in the brain is a contributory factor to every form of neurological disorder that is known, from depression to Alzheimer's to Parkinson's to autism to ADHD to schizophrenia to bipolar disorder. They're all related to inflammation. But every other disease outside of brain diseases themselves is also related to inflammation. Cancer is related to inflammation. Asthma is related to inflammation. Metabolic disorders like obesity is related to inflammation. Diabetes is related to inflammation. So what we're actually doing is we're ingesting a substance that clearly from scientific studies has shown increases inflammatory biomarkers in the body. These are the substances that cause or trigger a cascade of inflammatory responses on a cellular level. And fluoride at relatively low levels, certainly lower than what we would have here in Ireland because of not just water fluoridation, but because of our other intakes of fluoride, which I'll address in a minute, which is to do with our consumption of tea, would clearly be a very predominant factor in the health outcomes and morbidity that we have among the population with regards to disease in this country today. Like it's just such a Pandora's box, and it's really so shocking when you delve into it in any serious level. The level of incompetence or criminal complacency that has occurred in this country over the last 50 years with regards to water fluoridation. When people talk about water fluoridation, it was introduced into Ireland in the 1960s. Fluoridation is in the consumption of fluoride. It wasn't. Fluoridation, the Irish population were fluoridated long before water fluoridation ever started, and it started really after the Great Famine in the 1870s, when consumption of tea in Ireland started to increase in a dramatic fashion. And in the 1870s and 1880s, people were substituting food in Ireland, food intake in terms of solid foods, with tea and bread. And by the 1910s, we had overtaken Great Britain with regards to consumption of tea. We were the largest consumers of tea in the world, next to Australia and New Zealand. Those three countries were the highest consumers of tea. In the 1930s, researchers identified that tea was a plant that was a hyperaccumulator of fluoride. So they knew that the tea plant absorbed fluoride from the soil and it concentrated in the tea leaf. And when you made tea, it was released from the tea leaf into the beverage that you consumed, and it was a very significant source of fluoride intake. In 1948, a medical physician in New Zealand, way before they started fluoridation in New Zealand, did a study on medical students in Auckland University, which looked at their fluoride intake from tea during a time when there was rationing of tea in New Zealand. And she measured their urine levels and blood levels of fluoride and the fluoride level in tea, and she identified that in 1948 the biggest single source of fluoride exposure for the New Zealand population was drinking tea. And yet, she published 2 studies on it, and yet when they decided to introduce fluoridation in New Zealand in the 1950s, they never referenced her work. New Zealand was number 2 in the world for tea consumption at that stage.
Now, is there a difference there between artificial fluoridation and fluoride in the tea? Is that the natural occurring fluoride that people were getting in the tea in the early 1900s, as opposed to the artificial hexafluorosilic acid that we're getting now?
Yeah, there's a big difference between the two in many respects, because when you drink tea, there's fluoride in it, but tea also contains antioxidants, so they balance out the toxicity that's there with regards to the toxic dose of fluoride that you're ingesting. So they reduce the impact of it. But when we add hexafluorosilic acid to the water supply, we're not putting in antioxidants with it. We're putting in a very concentrated chemical that eats through concrete and is highly toxic into a water supply that here in County Cork contains very little calcium in it. So there's very little buffering capacity in the water to be able to neutralize the toxicity of the fluoride ion, which is extremely reactive. It's the most reactive element in the periodic table. It destabilizes everything. I mean, it's why fluoride ion is used in chemical warfare weapons, from sarin gas to mustard gas. It's the principal agent involved in it. Fluoride was used for the processing of uranium in the Second World War. It's dealt very well by Christopher Boyson in his book there. They would not have been able to make the nuclear bomb without having fluoride chemistry as a principal part in the extraction of uranium. and it, with regards to the toxicity of the chemical in the water supply, the dose might be lower than what you're getting in tea, but as I mentioned, you have antioxidants in tea which buffer it, whereas you don't in water. And really, in Ireland, the issue of toxicity of fluoride, it works on a number of levels. You have the adult population that are chronically exposed to fluoride from drinking tea, which is their major source of fluoride. The water is an additive effect to it. It doesn't help to be making tea with fluoridated water, for example. And then you have infants under 12 months of age who are chronically exposed to fluoride because they're making infant formula and preparing it for consumption for the infant using tap water that has fluoride in it. So every single mammal on the planet that has evolved to minimize to an absolute limit the amount of fluoride that would be excreted in breast milk. So no matter what species you look at, no matter what the dose the mother would be getting of fluoride, very little of the fluoride would be passed in breast milk. And we've evolved in that fashion like every other animal, because fluoride is toxic to the brain and it's toxic to the soft organs, and you're not going to give an infant who has not fully developed in terms of their ability to fight any of these inflammatory disorders or conditions in their body to deal with it. So what happened, not just in Ireland but in the United States and in other countries that are fluoridated, really occurred in the 1980s, when the dietary patterns of infants changed quite radically. Mothers were told no longer to give whole cow's milk to their infants until after 12 months of age. So I was born in the 60s, and a lot of infants would have been given cow's milk from 4 months on to drink. And powdered infant formula was used minimally. But in the 1980s, the sale and use of powdered infant formula shot up dramatically. So in 1980, if you look at infant formula or infant foods sales in the United States in terms of the various products that were used to feed infants, powdered infant formula was 5% of the entire market for feeding infants in the United States. And by 1995, it was over 95%. So you had this huge, dramatic increase in children being given powdered infant formula. And at the same time in the United States, the number of communities being given fluoridated water increased dramatically. And so the exposure among infants increased alarmingly, and the same happened in Ireland. And we know that happened in Ireland in the 1980s, because when you look at the differences in dental fluorosis between adolescents who were born before 1980 and children who were born after 1980, there was a 7-fold increase, a 700% increase in dental fluorosis among children born after 1980 in Ireland. 700%. And you have to look then in parallel with that as to, well, what other changes occurred around that time in Ireland in terms of that, you know, apart from dental fluorosis, in terms of infant health. Asthma rates in Ireland increased by 500% among children. When I was a child in school, there wasn't one child in my class who was asthmatic. And now we have the highest rates of asthma in Europe, and coincidentally the highest rates of asthma in the world are in Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And it's not to do with our climate, because the increases have occurred quite dramatically, to the level now that one in 4 boys in Ireland is asthmatic at 12 years of age. I mean, it's really astounding, the differences that are there. And we have higher rates of asthma in Ireland, by the way, than the most polluted, heavy industrialized regions of Europe. And nobody's asking questions about it. And how that ties into water fluoridation is this. Among all the industries that exist, the one that would have the highest occupational exposures to fluoride in the world would be in the aluminium smelting industry, because of the chemicals and substances they use in the processing of aluminium. And in the pot room where they smelt aluminium, they have occupational health and safety standards for the protection of workers. So they have to measure their blood levels and urine levels of fluoride exposure to make sure that the workers don't suffer from fluoride poisoning. And if you look at the data for Europe, for countries that have smelters, if you were an adult male, perfectly healthy, and spent an 8-hour or 10 hours working in the pot room of an aluminium smelter, your blood levels in a non-fluoridated region of Europe, because the rest of Europe is non-fluoridated when it comes to water, would be about 3 micromolars is the unit that they use. And if you were a breastfed baby in a non-fluoridated country, your blood levels would be about 0.22. Okay? And they've never done a study in Ireland to measure blood fluoride levels in babies, or in Australia, or in New Zealand. And the only study that's ever been done was in a fluoridated city in the United States, and it was done by accident. They actually did another one in Kansas, but when they were measuring the blood fluoride levels in infants, they looked at the blood fluoride levels of breastfed babies, and then they gave mothers in a fluoridated city formula milk made with deionized water, and they said, now you give that to your baby and we'll measure their blood levels. But they didn't give them tap water. Now, why didn't they give them tap water? Because that's what the parents make it with. But the babies who were given infant formula, even with deionized water, their blood levels were significantly higher than the babies who were breastfed. And in another city in the United States, they were looking at the blood levels of babies who were born with chronic kidney disease, because it's relatively common that you would have a condition of chronic kidney disease in babies, and they needed controls. So they took a bunch of babies who were under 12 months of age, who were fed normally, and they measured their blood levels. There was no control in terms of giving their babies deionized water, because they don't make infant formula at home with deionized water. And the blood levels of the infants, the average blood level of the infants was 4 micromolars. So it was actually higher than what you would get for an adult after an 8 to 12 hour shift in the most contaminated industrial environmental exposure to fluoride. But the maximum level that they recorded among the infants was 8 micromolars, which is more than double what the level is found in adults in an aluminium smelter. And those biomarkers are very important, because the studies in occupational medicine that have looked at the effect of fluoride exposure in the aluminium industry have found that the single biggest health risk associated with it is asthma and respiratory disorders, and then followed by musculoskeletal and skeletal fluorosis issues. And what they found was that for every 0.5 of a micromolar increase in blood levels, you had an increased inflammatory response in the lungs, for every 0.5. And you had a doubling of the bronchial responsiveness when it got to 3 micromolars. So, and that's in an adult. So you take that back then to a baby under 12 months of age being fed infant formula and having blood levels up to 8. Their lungs are only developing. They haven't fully formed. Their anti-inflammatory, antioxidant system in their body is depressed. Every baby is born with a kidney function that is equivalent to that of an adult with chronic kidney disease. Their kidneys only function at about 10% of what a healthy adult's would be. So they can't excrete fluoride, which is why their blood levels are high. And the kidneys won't really function effectively until about 10 months of age, and that's when the blood levels will decline in the infant. So it's really in that first year that the exposure to a child in terms of its effect on the soft organs of the body, and that's the brain, the lungs, the heart, the liver, kidney, and everything else, is the most susceptible period for an infant. And all they're looking at is teeth. And the same mechanisms that cause dental fluorosis in children, and one of the studies published in 2004, 2005 in Ireland was measuring dental fluorosis at levels of 70% of children in Ireland with dental fluorosis. One of the factors that causes it is a altered expression of genes. So it's getting back to what they talked about there. So they're finding that the white spots in teeth that are occurring and the lines that are occurring in teeth, a part of it is because of the toxic effect of fluoride on gene expression and how it alters genes, and those genes alter protein expression. And if they're doing that in teeth, well then what are they doing in other parts of the body with regards to potentially contributing to other disorders? What I'm finding in my work, like I have a huge amount of work done on asthma at this stage, because I've managed to identify about 50 biological markers that have each independently been found to be associated with asthma. And when I found those markers, I then researched to see, well, has fluoride been found to be associated with that biomarker? And every single one of those biomarkers, I've been able to find that fluoride is actually a trigger for every single one of them. And they've never joined the dots. It's quite astonishing that they've never joined the dots. There is millions and millions of dollars or euros that have been spent looking at the causes of asthma, and they've never looked at fluoride. And the highest rates of asthma in the world are in the countries with water fluoridation at rates 5 or 6 times anywhere else in the world, and they've never researched it. And you'd wonder why. And you'd go like, okay, there's the liability aspect of it, like, but if you look at the profits that are also to be made from this, in the United States alone, they spend, the cost of asthma alone is in the region of 75 billion a year. That's what it costs the United States economy. There's a lot of people making a lot of money out of selling medications for a disease that they don't really necessarily want the cause of the disease to stop. They prefer to treat the disease. Asthma is costing this country a phenomenal amount of money. I mean, we have the highest hospitalization rates in Europe for asthma. We have the highest rates of childhood asthma. We have the highest rates of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease among adults in Europe. It's, you know, it is pandemic in this country. And yet they'll say it's dust mites that are causing it, or it's the damp weather or whatever. We had dust mites and damp weather in Ireland before the 1980s. And why isn't it happening in other countries that would have those conditions at the same level that were happening here? And the mechanisms have been shown. Like, I've researched the studies that have been done. I've read the research that has been done on animal studies on fluoride exposure by ingesting it, right? Not just inhaling it. So the toxicity to the lungs occurs not just by breathing it in, but by drinking it or eating it. Once it gets into your blood system, you have a very large supply of blood to the lung organs. And when fluoride is in the lung, it's causing inflammation in the lung, and it's changing the actual structure of the lungs itself. And when it happens at a really young age, that damage can be permanent. So that child could end up with asthma for life, or could end up with impaired lung function for the rest of their life. Some kids won't get it, others kids will, and there are many factors associated with that. So like there's been 7 different genes that have been identified. They're called polymorphisms that exist in humans that have been shown to increase the susceptibility of a human to the toxicity of fluoride. If you carry one of those genes, you're more likely to have dental fluorosis. If you carry another gene, you're more likely to have bone disorders. It affects, because fluoride, when you ingest it, when it's in your blood tries to get rid of it, or your body tries to get rid of it because it doesn't want it in your circulation affecting your organs. What it can't excrete in your urine is still in your blood, so it pushes it into your bones. So your bones act as a landfill for toxins, get it out of circulation. So nearly 99% of all the fluoride that's in your body is concentrated in your bones, and it builds up to extremely high levels over your lifetime. It's cumulative, so it just adds and adds and adds and adds. So if you, it starts in pregnancy with a baby, because if the mother is living in a fluoridated area, she's consuming fluoride, it's passing through the placenta into the baby, and the baby is being exposed to it pre-birth. When they're born, they're then getting a huge dose of it from fluoride with infant formula, and then they've got it for the rest of their life. So like kids in Ireland are basically being exposed at a rate to fluoride at a very young age that is unprecedented in human history. I mean, people will say, oh, they've had problems with fluoride in water supply in India and China for millennia.
Just take it off.
India and China have one of the worst rates of fluorosis in the world, massive problem with contaminated water supplies. But up until very recently, nearly 98% of mothers in India were breastfeeding their babies for 2 years, and in China up until 3 years. So like, they weren't using infant formula. The babies were protected because they were drinking breast milk at the most susceptible period of their life. So you then bring it back to what I'm talking about in terms of evolutionary biology. Every mammal has evolved not to excrete fluoride in breast milk, and then suddenly we turned evolution on its head in the 1980s. And you need to take it in this context. The amount of fluoride that would be in formula milk made with fluoridated tap water would be in the region of 30,000% higher than what would be in breast milk. 30,000%. And no one's going, well, we're seeing a dramatic increase in neurological disorders in children, dramatic increase in childhood obesity, diabetes, cancer, leukemia, all of these things. Why isn't anyone asking questions?